2.5 Admins, episode 194. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, just a quick plug. You were on Late Night Linux with us recently, Jim.
Seems unlikely.
That's what you said on Late Night Linux. You're just trying to freak me out now.
That's the joke.
One of them is already available, and the next episode next week will also have you on it. So, link in the show notes. Let's do some news then. There's been a lot of buzz about Mastodon recently and DDoSing people's websites, because if you post a link to Mastodon, then it generates a preview. And if you've got a lot of followers and those people are on enough different instances, then each instance will generate that preview. And a lot of people have started to complain that their sites are just getting effectively DDoSed.
Yeah, because of the way the preview caching works, when you send out the message to all your followers, all the instances of people that follow you will see that and try to cache it. And it means that when you first send it out, you can end up effectively creating a barrage of traffic against your own website.
This is more an issue of clustering a bunch of requests, all into the same few seconds than it is like an issue of actual overall traffic. Because we're talking about generating previews here. It's not even as heavy as an actual site visit. And in theory, you would like for everybody who is shared or is looking at the link that's on Mastodon to be able to actually view your website. And if your website were capable of handling that level of traffic, then the level of traffic caused from generating these previews would just be nothing. It would just be a wash. And in fact, we can see some of this with, 2.5 Admins and Late Night Linux. We post our episodes on Mastodon, and we haven't experienced a huge issue with this. Now, we did see 2.5admins.com locking up a few times right about the time that Joe initially made that move, and I increased my tuning limits on it to help accommodate that. That might be related, but again, we're not actually seeing problems. With that said, there are folks who get a whole lot more traffic and, get shared on a whole lot more instances pretty quickly than we do, and they could see larger issues. And what this has really come from is the fact that when it's all about the multiple instances. This doesn't happen on like a Twitter or a Blue Sky or a Threads because it's basically one single monolithic thing. And if somebody shares it, the site gets the preview, and then everybody sees that cached copy of the preview that lives, on Twitter or on Blue Sky or on Threads or whatever. On Mastodon, when you share something, everybody who follows you from a different instance, once they need to look at that, their own instance goes and hits your site and grabs its own cache. So rather than the original instance forwarding along the link preview to any other instances that need it, every instance that needs it needs to go to your site separately and grab it.
And there's nothing in the ActivityPub protocol to deal with this yet. So it's something that's going to have to be implemented. And that's not easy.
I'm not sure it is something that has to be implemented because there are security considerations here. And, quote, fixing this, unquote, would in part undo some of the advantages that you get out of federation to begin with. Part of the whole point of having, Mastodon be a federated platform is this idea that, the individual pieces can actually operate individually, and you're also minimizing some of the InfoSec concerns, from having all your eggs in one basket. So it would be relatively trivial if we ignore, necessary patch schedules and protocol inconsistency and whatever. It would be fairly simple to say, okay, well, if I'm an instance and I see that one of my users needs a link preview because of something that they're looking at coming from your instance, I can just request a cached copy of that from your instance. Only thing is, if you do that, now you're setting up a chain in which you can attack one instance by generating bogus previews on another instance that you control and expect that to actually travel from instance to instance. So that's a bit of a security concern, and I'm not sure we actually want to fix that.
Well, and also, it somewhat breaks part of the point of the federation in that the idea is to distribute the cost of the bandwidth and the processing to create the preview. If the instance I'm on, and I have a huge number of followers, and it's now responsible for not just generating the preview for all of its users, but now every other instance is going to expect it to pay for the bandwidth of providing at least one copy of that preview, then that's putting a lot more load on that one instance. And the entire idea of federation is that I'm paying for my users, not for every user in the entire network.
A lot of this comes down to what your site is doing in terms of generating the previews that platforms like Twitter or Mastodon or whatever use. And if your site is generating like really fat previews that require a lot of bandwidth for your site to deliver, maybe you should look at trimming that on your own end.
Well, it depends. I think most of the previews are actually software at the site is going to pretend to be a browser and load the page. And actually, most of the time is using the browser engine to render a picture of the page. So it's usually that software rather than your website that's making the preview.
Yeah, but it's still hitting your database if it's a PHP-based site, for example.
Well, importantly, unlike old like web scrapers, it probably is actually loading all of the JavaScript and all of the images because it's using an actual browser engine to make a screenshot of what the website looks like and then scaling it down. And so as far as the website's concerned, it's actually no less expensive than a real visit from a real user because it's going to run all the JavaScript to make sure that the website actually looks like it's going to look when you go there. And depending on how this protocol works, if every instance is generating this as soon as I post it, not the first time a user actually tries to view it, because again, the idea of doing this ahead of time is that the user sees the preview right away, not, I have to go to the website and generate the preview as the first time someone tries to load it. It's effectively like however number of instances my followers are spread across, all those people are going to go to the website in a very, very short time span, which is probably more traffic than just the total you might have gotten in a 1 minute time span of all your followers going to the website at once.
Joe raised an excellent point, though. Joe mentioned that a lot of the load issues that people are seeing are probably not just bandwidth. That is a very fair point. And the reason I was focused on bandwidth is because this shouldn't be generating database load on your site because your site should already be doing object and image caching. And after the first load, it should be using really nothing but bandwidth to feed the other horde of instances that want the exact same thing. So if you haven't already got that set up, this will take you out quick because it'll hammer your database to death when you suddenly get, potentially several hundred users in the same second that are hitting full fat page loads off of everything. So if you don't already have proper caching set up on your site, that's the absolute first thing that you've got to get taken care of. And honestly, you really already needed to do that properly. This just kind of draws an underline under it.
This might also point out a slightly subtle part of the idea of caching. So there's two things that, for example, Varnish does. The first is the problem of a thundering herd. So normally the way caching works is the first person comes to your website, you pay the full freight for that, and then we save what that website was. We save the objects at the end so we can reuse them next time. But if while that first person were building up all the stuff to do that, a second person comes along, most websites by default will do all that work again because there's no cached copy yet. And then a third person and will do the work again. And you'll have 8 workers building up this full version of the website. And only once the first person actually finishes do we have a cached copy to serve to the next person. And so mitigating that thundering herd, oftentimes what I think Nginx can be configured to do it and Varnish will do is only the first person is going to actually make it through to the back end. And once we have the cached copy, we will then serve the page to everybody else. And Varnish has a second mechanism called Grace, where basically if we have a timeout, say we only cache the page for 10 minutes so that if somebody does more, if people post comments or whatever, the page will stay fresh. With the Grace, when the first person comes through and the cache is expired, it's going to trigger loading the new version in the background, but it's actually going to serve that person and anybody else that comes along until the new cache version is done, the stale version from 10 minutes ago. That way the website keeps working and we keep giving out the slightly stale version of the page until we have that new version of the page to serve.
Now, the poor man's version of this is simply tuning your Apache or Nginx properly so that it doesn't attempt to serve more concurrent page loads than your system can actually manage. So let's say you've got a cheap $5 VM at Linode or DigitalOcean or Vultr or wherever. If you've got your Apache and your PHP tuned down to only serve 5 or 10 concurrent visitors, and it can actually do that, and you've tested that and that works, then you really don't need to worry too much about that because your worst case scenario is you get 50 incoming requests simultaneously, or 500 if you prefer, and the first 5 or 10 go directly to the back end, but you can handle that because you've got it tuned to where you can't have too many concurrent requests hitting your back end for your back end not to be able to fulfill it. So you fulfill Those 5 or those 10 paying the full freight, sure, but that only occupies half a second or so, and then the rest of the 500 of the thundering herd, they do all get fulfilled from cache. Where you have a problem is if you didn't bother tuning your PHP stack and your web server, and instead you get those 500 incoming requests and it tries to fulfill all 500 straight from the metal at the same time. That happens, you got a problem. Thing about that is, if that happens for any other reason, 500 people all want to view 500 different pages at the same time, you still have a problem because rather than putting them in a queue and servicing them as quickly as it can, your server tries to serve all of them at once, falls flat on its face, and you get, somebody calling you and saying, hey, website's down.
Right, or you get 504s or whatever. And yeah, kind of to that exact point, the only downside to relying just on a low number of workers is if it is people trying to load 10 different pages if you have a more popular website. But if your website has that diverse of visitors, you're probably not running off the $5 VM at that point. So yeah, you don't need to go and set up a lot of fancy varnish and write a whole VCL config when if it's a WordPress and you're probably only going to have one popular blog post at a time, then there's no reason that your $5 VM won't be able to handle that.
And if it's WordPress, there are caching plugins that will do almost all of this work for you. I installed W3 Total Cache and install the dependencies that it's looking for. I would recommend Memcached and PHP APC and make sure that it's using those for all of the caching mechanisms. And that's it. You're done. Congratulations. You have a high performance stack.
Yeah. I've done that for news websites, for actual broadcast television stations in other countries that had serious amounts of traffic. And it wasn't a $5 VM, but it was only a couple of pretty modest web servers, and they were able to handle huge amounts of traffic by just using that W3 Total Cache.
It's worth mentioning that the Mastodon developers are working on a proper fix for this, but that has been delayed. And in the meantime, their sort of quick fix is to make each instance wait a random time between 0 and 60 seconds before generating the preview, which helps spread the load a little bit.
Yeah, smearing that load over even 60 seconds can make a huge difference to the web server being able to handle it.
Surely using a CDN should mitigate this, shouldn't it?
It absolutely should. Now, with that said, we have seen a fair number of the complaints coming in include, hey, we use Cloudflare and we still have this problem. We're still getting DOS'd. And I think it's important that we point out that if you're using Cloudflare or some other content distribution network and this little bit of traffic spike coming from Mastodon is still taking your site down, you have not deployed your CDN correctly, and you need to fix that.
And that's something like W3 Total Cache has the stuff to do that, because a lot of those CDNs rely on your origin web server, including the right headers to say, CDN, this is how long you can cache this for. And these are the things you need to do to tell the difference between a logged in user and a not logged in user, so you can tell that it's okay to cache this even though it has a cookie and things like that. When I did consulting for this kind of stuff in the past, I did it for a very, very large newspaper here in Canada, and they were paying for the most expensive CDN out there, the original OG CDN. And they got to the point where just the origin servers for the CDN was enough traffic that when they post a new news story, they would get hits from 270 of these caching nodes spread around the world for this CDN only. And that was enough to take out their web stack because it was a Microsoft-based web stack. And so we put a bunch of FreeBSD, Varnish, and Nginx stuff in front of it and implemented all this caching to make the CDN work. And yeah, we literally sold them a service to make their CDN stop taking out their website.
It's a CDN for the CDN.
Yeah, it was a CDN for the CDN almost. Or it was a caching layer in front of their website to protect the website from the CDN. Because their web server was so limited being IIS based and all the backend was ASP and it just didn't have any of the tuning that we've been talking about, we put Nginx and Varnish in front of it so that we could inject all the right configuration to protect the Microsoft servers from the Akamai servers.
I've had to use Varnish for the exact same thing, to protect horrible little vulnerable IIS ASP servers quite a few times.
Microsoft plans to lock down Windows DNS like never before.
Well, I mean, that's a pretty easy conclusion to draw, given that they've never locked down DNS before at all. Essentially, what we're looking at here is a combination of encrypted DNS and an odd sort of an allow block list feature to tell a DNS server, I'm unwilling to resolve these domains and I am willing to resolve those other domains, along with a protocol bump to allow I believe this is in Active Directory. It might be further down in the stack. You can tell client Windows machines the only DNS you're allowed to use is my DNS.
Yeah, I think part of this is a response to things like browsers deciding they want to do their own DNS over HTTPS and things like that.
Yeah, which makes it very difficult as an admin to block websites, right?
Right, and to control what's happening on your network, yeah. And so, yeah, their new Zero Trust DNS, which is encrypted and use cryptographic authentication for the connections between the end user and the DNS server so that you know you're talking to the DNS server you're expecting. So this ideally would also stop machines from being tricked into talking to, an 8.8.8.8 that isn't Google and things like that. So that when you configure, especially in a corporate environment where the Active Directory is pushing configuration to the client machines, they know that those client machines aren't going to get tricked into talking to something else.
To be clear, that does also imply that your DNS server knows exactly which authenticated user requested to resolve muckyjpegs.com.
Yeah, I guess it is mutual authentication too, isn't it?
Yeah, this feels like very good for you as an administrator and as an organization. Not so good for the people who are your actual users or employees.
Little column A, little column B. It's bad for users or employees in terms of privacy for the exact reason I just mentioned. But it's potentially good for them in that it makes it easier for admins to keep them from clicking the shiny link and doing really stupid crap. Yeah, it's one of the issues right now is that it used to be, we expected to have things like, now granted, they usually didn't work anywhere near as well as they were, built to work. But we used to have like central firewalls, that would do deep packet inspection and say, no, this is bad traffic. I'm not going to let this get to my user who I'm trying to protect. Well, you can't do that anymore when everything's HTTPS and, DNS over HTTPS and yada, yada, yada. If it's end-to-end encrypted, well, if you're in the middle, you can't intervene for good any more than you can intervene for evil.
It sounds like this is going to end up on a lot of compliance forms.
Possibly. Like I've already seen that where, yeah, if you want to visit certain websites now that are part of the Office 365 SSO, it's like you can only do that if you're running a machine that's running a configuration that's compliant with the policy. So you can't just access it from any laptop. It has to be a laptop that has all of the corporate policies applied. Like, for example, maybe using this Zero Trust DNS, which is basically a way to integrate Windows' DNS engine into its filtering platform, which is a core component of Windows Firewall, and have that all happen on the client. But there's some extra pull quotes here from Jake Williams, who's the VP of Research and Development at a consultancy on these, and saying it's basically providing a way to have kind of an input and output to the firewall hooked into this so that the firewall has input on where you're going and what's going on.
The Windows firewall, to be clear.
Yes, sorry. To be clear, the Windows firewall, you can trigger firewall actions. So data going into the firewall will decide what the firewall does, but also trigger external actions based on firewall output. So instead of having to reinvent this, you can have antivirus and your web filtering proxy and all that stuff hooked in together and knowing all about it.
To be fair, that also sounds like if your machine already got owned, your attacker might put in rules that say, hey, don't bother firewall checking anything coming from badguy.com.
Right. Or you can only do DNS lookups from bad guy's DNS server, so you're never going to get to the real Google ever again.
To be fair, malware authors could already do that one way or the other. They just break your stack and make it, non-configurable and, well, usually break it as well. But those attempts to lock you into a DNS server, I've seen quite a lot of that for more than a decade.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Tailscale. Go to tailscale.com/25A. Tailscale is an intuitive, programmable way to manage a private network. It's zero-trust network access that every organization can use, and with Tailscale's ACL policies, you can securely control access to devices and services with next-gen network access controls. Loads of the late-night Linux family hosts use Tailscale for all sorts, including controlling 3D printers, remoting into their relative systems for support, controlling Home Assistant, and sending ZFS snapshots to off-site backup locations. I got it set up in minutes, and you can too. So support the show and check out Tailscale for yourself. Go to tailscale.com/25A and try out Tailscale for free for up to 100 devices and 3 users with no credit card required. That's tailscale.com/25A. Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Another perk of being a patron is you get to skip the queue, which is what William has done. He writes, is there any decent consumer-grade backup media for write-once archival purposes? My use case is I want to store some personal photos as is in some kind of offsite storage unit or something, and really only read from these backups in the event of a disaster.
The short answer is no, there really just isn't. The somewhat longer answer is you can't use cheap DVD-ROMs, not only because they're far too tiny and you'll spend your entire life trying to back anything up, but also just because consumer DVD-ROMs don't actually live forever. They degrade over time, and you don't know how long they're going to take to degrade. And once they have degraded, if you weren't paying attention when it happened, your data's just gone and you'll never ever get it back. So we can talk about larger optical drives. Well, that's Blu-ray. Again, you can't use just a regular El Cheapo Blu-ray disc, so you're looking for something called archival grade. An archival grade disc should, in theory, last at least 10 years, and some claim up to a century. But again, long-term testing of archival optical discs has shown that sometimes they last longer than the regular ones, and sometimes they don't. Even worse, when you talk about the archival grade Blu-rays, I looked up prices just before we recorded, and you're going to spend about $200 a terabyte. So I'm just going to go ahead and say, no, you're not doing that either. So essentially what you're looking at here is going to be long-term cold storage of magnetic media. You can use something like LTO tapes, but I would honestly recommend just consumer hard drives, man. Pick 2.5 or 3.5, whichever form factor you prefer. If you don't want to touch these things for long periods of time, you're just going to put them in cold storage in a vault somewhere, make sure it's climate controlled and you don't have any magnetic field issues. You should be fine. I would probably recommend do 2 backups onto 2 different drives and store them. You still should really check them every few years, but it's going to be a whole lot quicker and easier to pull them and check them because you can literally just import the pool and scrub and make sure that you didn't have any errors pop up. And if you didn't, you're fine.
Yeah. And sort of that, especially looking at comparatively the price of the archival grade Blu-rays, for that much money over even a 10-year term, having a machine with that hard drive spinning and scrubbing it every month is going to cost you less per terabyte, including a whole computer and the electricity.
Easily. It's not even going to be close.
Hard drives down to almost $10 a terabyte now versus $200 for the archival media. And like Jim said, that archival media is they say maybe it'll last that long, but Blu-rays haven't been around long enough to be 100% sure. And the sample ones that the lab used lasted that long. How long do the ones you bought at a store that sat on a shelf and were in a truck for who knows how long, and all the other effects that might mean they just don't work anymore.
And if you had 2 hard drives, you could maybe pull one out 1 week, scrub it, make sure it's all good, take it back, take the other one, scrub that. So you've always got one in the backup location.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it doesn't have to be weekly, like Jim was saying. If you're checking them twice a year or something, that's probably fine too.
Yeah, but don't take them both out at the same time because then you don't have anything in that emergency backup location.
Yeah, you didn't want the house fire to hit you while you're checking your backups.
Yeah. And more importantly, this should not be the only backup, obviously. As an extra 3rd or 4th backup, yeah, fine. But this should definitely not be your primary backup.
Agreed. If for no other reason than that your primary backup should be a lot easier to get at than this, honestly.
Yep.
Tony, who's a patron, also skipped the queue. He writes, I have a Microsoft SQL Server that I need to try and get more performance out of. I do not see any memory or CPU bottlenecks, so I'm planning on putting in 2 Dell SATA SSDs and mirroring them in ZFS on my Proxmox. Would it be better to use a ZVol versus a Qcow 2? Also, by using Qcow 2, will I prematurely wear my SSDs?
Okay, so to start out, you're absolutely on the right track for improving your performance on any kind of a database engine. Yes, you do want to put that on ZFS mirrors, and the Dell SATA SSD should do fine. That's not necessarily going to be the highest performance solid state you could get, but again, it should be fine, especially if these things look like improvements to what you have now. You should be very happy with it. The other thing that I'll mention is usually I prefer either raw files or Qcow 2 to ZVols, but you are a Proxmox user, so Proxmox's user interface is going to fight you pretty hard on trying to create VMs using Qcow 2, I would say just go ahead and do zvol, because that's what Proxmox really wants to do when you're a Proxmox user. Now, the one thing I would advise you, Proxmox is going to by default make the vol block size either 8K, which is far too small, or 16K if it's the newest version of Proxmox, which is still probably smaller than you want. SQL Server has a variable page size, but it operates typically in extents rather than pages, and a default extent size on SQL Server is 64K. So I would probably recommend vol block size equals 64K for that virtual machine. The combination of that and 2 SSDs in mirror is going to make you very happy.
Yeah, a couple of caveats. Depends on the version of Microsoft SQL Server, but in the past, it had problems if you tried to expose a physical sector size that it didn't understand. The really old ones didn't even support 4K, but I'm sure you're probably newer than that now. But depending on how the hypervisor works, it might actually expose the vol block size as the sector size to the VM, in which case Windows will see that that virtual hard drive is having a sector size of 64K, and the Microsoft SQL Server might say, no, that drive's not compatible. So if you do see that, then you might have to configure Proxmox to have the vol block size match whatever the SQL server is looking for. But if it doesn't yell at you, just do what Jim said, and it'll be fine.
You absolutely do not want to try to match vol block size to anything that an ancient version of SQL Server thinks of as the physical sector size of the drive, because that's going to be way, way, way too small. In the unlikely event that that happens, I would recommend instead, like that is the point where it becomes worth fighting Proxmox's UI and just creating a raw file and a data set and basing your VM on that. It is possible to do in Proxmox. It's just a pain in the butt.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there's also probably a setting somewhere in Proxmox to just tell it what sector size to tell the VM that the disk is, no matter what it is. Because I know Beehive on BSD can do that. And that's what we've done in the past when trying to support existing SQL Server installs that were being migrated from VMware or whatever. And we had to make it feel the same so that it would just keep working.
What about prematurely wearing SSDs then?
That's not an issue. Using Qcow 2 storage or raw file storage is not going to produce any amplification. It's going to be no different than doing zvols.
Yeah. If you did a Qcow 2 and left the default record size of 128K, it might be a little bit, but also, unless you're buying stupendously low-end SSDs, you're not going to be able to wear the SSD out, especially a SATA interfaced one where you're not going to be able to write gigabytes per second to it 24/7 for 5 years.
I'm going to push back on that one. It is entirely possible to wear through the whatever random crap Dell sends you for SSDs in 5 years, depending on your workload. I have absolutely had small business clients do it. If this is faffing about in a home lab, no, it's very unlikely. But if this is Microsoft SQL in like a real production environment with, say, 10 engineers hitting it all day long, yeah, you may very well be able to burn through that in 5 years.
That's a good point. I failed to realize that, yes, when you said a Dell SSD, it's going to be whatever Dell gave you, not the high-end one you picked that had a high write endurance. Dell likes to charge you quite a bit more for the drives that actually have a reasonable number of drive writes per day.
Yeah, and when you just say Dell SATA, we don't actually know if we're talking about, if it's going to be an off-label, rebranded consumer Samsung, which is usually what you get when you buy, quote, Dell-branded SSDs, like for a laptop or, any consumer device, or whether it's going to be white-labeled enterprise SSDs, which you can also get from Dell, which they will charge you way too much for. Another option, if you don't have to stick with Dell-branded gear and you just want a really good, not that expensive solid-state drive that will offer you a ton of performance and write endurance and hardware QoS that keeps that database operating, with consistent low latency that you're looking for, I really like Kingston's DC600M line. They offer about double the endurance per terabyte of drive size that high-end consumer drives, like a Samsung Pro offer. And that hardware QoS is no joke, man. They don't look quite as fast with like a single-threaded FIO run going across them, but the difference in latency between your worst results and your best results is just almost non-existent on those drives, whereas with consumer SSDs, it can be quite large.
And what sort of size would you be looking at for this job, do you reckon?
That's the other thing I was just about to mention to Jim's point. Don't get the smallest SSDs that'll fit your database. The bigger the SSD is, the more endurance it's going to have, especially if you're not using it all. And they tend to also be better performance, just because you're spreading that same amount of work out over more flash cells.
Your minimum purchase should be a 1 terabyte SSD these days. There is just no reason to buy smaller than that. And if 1 terabyte isn't enough to get you to let's say 50% drive space free when you first dump your workload on it, then you should be looking at larger drives than that. But don't buy anything smaller than 1 terabyte. There's just no reason to.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/Mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.